Today I want to share some interesting information that I find interesting about attachment theory. This is information that is really relevant to what we do with regression work, and I believe it can really help you to facilitate healing in your sessions. Okay, so let's start with what is attachment. Essentially, attachment is just another word for emotional bonding. It's our ability to attach to loved ones. Attachment is something that improves our chances of survival. If we can bond with those who are going to take care of us, then they're going to take care of us. Attachment is about relationship, but it's about the relationship with the primary caregiver. So keep this in mind. Usually that's mom, and mom is the primary source of protection and nourishment and comfort for the child. So when you're going back into childhood, identify who that primary caregiver is, because that's the most important relationship to the child. Now, there's been lots of studies done in attachment, and some of the patterns that have shown up can be quite useful for you. First of all, these attachment patterns are installed during the first 12 months. So up until 1 year of age, these are getting installed. There was an interesting experiment that was done with children under the age of 12 months or up to a year old. And what they did was they sort of set up a daycare situation. And the parent would bring the child into the daycare, and the daycare was set up. It had lots of toys and things for the child to play with. But the parent would bring the child in. It was a strange environment and a strange person in that environment, and they would leave the child with this person in this kind of a daycare situation. There were no other children, just the one. Well, when the parent came back, what they noticed was that there were 4 distinct responses. The first pattern was that the parent would return, the child would go straight to the parent and greet the parent, and then it would go back to playing. And so this was identified as secure attachment. The child was okay, knew it was all right. The parent came back, greeted them, went back to playing. So this is an indication that the parent is sensitive to the needs of the child, that the parent is responding to the needs of the child in an adequate way, in a timely way. So the child feels secure. And what this results in is sort of healthy social and emotional and cognitive development, something to keep in mind, because that's kind of the benchmark for healthy emotional system. Well, the second pattern, what would happen was the parent would return and the child wouldn't really seem to care, wouldn't be very interested. It seemed as if it didn't matter to the child that the parent had come back. And so this was called avoidant attachment. So what they found this pattern was connected to is that the parent wasn't responding to the child's signal. For whatever reason, the parent didn't recognize what those signals meant, didn't know how to read them. So, for example, if the child cried, the parent wouldn't know what that meant. They wouldn't know how to respond to the cries of the child. Or what they did do to respond just didn't work. So the child's needs weren't being met, and the parent was probably getting pretty frustrated as well. So the child might cry because it was wet, and the parent would feed the child when in fact it needed to be changed. Or maybe it cried because it was tired, and the parent would change the baby. So what happened with the child was eventually, because the parent wasn't able to read these signals accurately and respond to them in a timely manner, the child would just sort of give up. And so that was that avoidant behavior that they were seeing. And what this results in later in life seems to be a kind of a socially controlling behavior. The person tends to avoid others and is not very interactive. In fact, they can be emotionally distant. Now, the third pattern that they identified was that the parent would come back to the daycare situation, and the child would go to the parent and would be very clingy and very needy, and not easily soothed. They'd be quite upset. And the child would not go back to playing right away either. It would just keep clinging to the parent. And this was identified as anxious or resistant attachment. So this is an anxious child. So the problem that they identified here was that this particular parent of this child, or the parent associated with this pattern, is inconsistent. So the child doesn't have the ability to predict what's going to happen. They don't know how the parent is going to respond. And this generates uncertainty in the child. They can't predict. And also it results in ambivalence toward the parent. Another cause of avoidant or resistant attachment is that the parent's emotional state is intrusive to the child. So mom's feelings overwhelm the child. So if you've got a parent that the primary caregiver has emotional problems or is mentally ill or something, then that's intrusive to the child, and the child doesn't know how to regulate that, so that becomes intrusive. If mom is angry or anxious, the child will take on those feelings, because very young children don't have the ability to separate themselves from mom or whoever that primary caregiver is. But here's the thing you want to watch for, especially if you get back into a scene within that first 12-month period, is that if mom is caught up in a mood and an emotion, if mom's angry or anxious, for example, and is in a situation, a scene with the child will associate those feelings, mom's feelings, which it thinks is its own feelings and is experiencing them as its own. It's going to anchor those to what's happening in that event. So let's say mom is anxious or angry while she's feeding the baby. Guess what that anxiety gets anchored to? Food. And so this particular pattern tends to show up in the teenage years. You'll find that the teenager will be sort of nervous and anxious. It shows up with insecurity and feelings of self-doubt and an inability to regulate their emotions. So, if you've got a teenager that's a drama queen, this is what you're probably looking at. You want to find out what was going on early, especially in those first 12 months. Now there is a fourth pattern, and the fourth pattern is where the the parent comes back to the playroom with a stranger, and the child's behavior is confused. The child might ignore the parent, or it might approach the parent and then avoid them. It might, seek closeness, but then not accept any comforting or any soothing from the parent. So it seems to be disrupted. It's confused behavior. One of the patterns they noticed was that this particular child would drop to the floor and bite their hands or go around in circles, start spinning around. So it's very confused behavior, and they called this disorganized attachment. And this particular pattern is a sign of trauma. So if you've got a child that doesn't know how to respond to the situation, and they're come here, go away, you've got some underlying trauma going on. Now, trauma for children can be caused by abuse. It can be caused by being yelled at. It can be caused by alcoholism in the family, because it's a very unpredictable environment for a child, and there's often out of control behavior, which can be terrifying. So that generates terror in the child. Now the child has a biological need to attach. If we don't attach, we don't survive. We know that biologically. A child is not able to take care of itself, so it needs to bond to a caregiver in order to have security. So that parent, whoever the primary caregiver is basically that child's source of protection and comfort and soothing and nourishment. But the parent, when the parent becomes the source of threat as well, it's kind of like sleeping with the enemy. There's a conflict here. The one place you've got to go to get your needs met is a danger. So the child doesn't have anywhere to go to get their needs met, and the only place that's available to them isn't safe. So that's the trauma, that's the internal conflict you're looking for. And this internal pattern of conflict sets up a biological conflict that can lead to disease. Now, German New Medicine is all about this. Also, Richard Fluke of Advanced Clearing Energetics has written a book called Why am I sick? And I really recommend this book if you want to understand disease patterns and how the mind-body works in terms of biology. It's a really easy read, and it'll give you a heads up on what's going on. If you're getting clients that have physiological disorders that are, especially if they're rooted in some kind of trauma, and most of our clients are, then that's a really good book to check out. So this biological conflict expresses as a moving toward and running away behavior. So both things are happening at the same time. It's kind of like having one foot on the brake and the other on the gas. And obviously something's got to give if you're doing that. So, but you'll see that with the child, and that's what they observed in that playroom. The child would go to the parent and then stop and then run away and then come back, and they didn't know how to behave. So what this develops later in life is a kind of social and emotional and cognitive impairment. Now, why is any of this important to you? Because these are learned responses, and they're learned in the first year, before the age of 1. This is how the child learned to adapt to, but this is important, it's to a specific relationship. This is the key, especially when you're getting down to the forgiveness work. Who needs to be forgiven? This is the person you want to identify, because this was source for that child. This is the person that was supposed to meet their needs, and they didn't. And in some cases, if it was, if there was a case of abuse, then this is the person that was supposed to provide safety and in fact was the source of threat and danger. So it's that specific relationship you want to identify. And so when the client comes to see you as an adult, what you'll find is that the subconscious mind has been trying to find a way to resolve this conflict, but it doesn't have the resources because it's locked in at the age at which those events occurred, which is often pretty early in life. And so its ways of resolving those conflicts are often things that we don't like, behaviors we don't like, symptoms that we don't like. But keep that in mind, that the symptoms that the client comes in with are the subconscious solution. They're not the problem. The problem is a life event. It's an experience. So the issue, the response, the behavior pattern, whatever it is you're dealing with, is specific to that very important relationship. It's really important. It's not about the child. It's about the relationship, and it's about the child's responses to that specific person. The child might be okay with another caregiver. They might be just fine with dad, for example, that mom's the problem for the child and creates all that anxiety and all of that confusion. Mom can be the source, or it could be, a sibling, or an older sibling or what have you. So you need to identify who that key person is. So pay attention to the child's relationship with their primary caregiver, especially if you're landing in an event before or during that first year of development. And if that happens to be mom, let's say it's mom, it could be somebody else, but if it's mom, then what you want to find out from the child are, what are mom's feelings toward the child? Now remember, these are the child's perceptions. May or may not be true, but we need to uncover that. So what are the feelings what feelings do mom have toward the child? And how is mom responding to the child? How is mom responding to the needs of the child? Find out what those perceptions are. Uncover, how is the child learning to adapt to mom's behaviors and mom's feelings? I mean, if mom's angry all the time, how is the child learning to cope with that? I had a client, her first year of life, mom was in grief because she'd had a child die while she was pregnant with that client. So the child's needs were being met by someone who was immersed in grief. Also find out what associations are being formed, because if a grieving mom is feeding a child, the child is feeling the grief and anchoring that to the food. So this could reveal a lifelong relationship pattern with mom. So you want to pay attention to when you're doing the intake. You might say, so tell me about your relationship with mom growing up, and the client will say, oh, we get along great now. So that's always a clue that their adult relationship with a parent is somehow different to how it was in childhood. So that's a clue. These attachment patterns can show up and be reflected in the client's relationship to their spouse. It may be reflected in past relationships with exes. You know, you've got somebody that's been divorced a couple of times. You're going to find that that same pattern may be there. And that is because unconsciously we can choose our partners as sort of stand-ins for those primary caregivers that, you know, didn't meet our needs. And it's as an attempt to try to resolve those childhood conflicts and finally get our needs met. So it's a repeating of the story, or the repeating of that pattern. Of course, we can't get our needs, the needs of the child met through our spouse, because the real problem isn't with the current relationship. I mean, the current relationship may be a problem as well, but the problem that we're trying to internally and subconsciously trying to resolve isn't in the present moment, it's in the past. The current relationship is simply a match for that pattern. And in fact, we may choose partners based on the fact that that's what's familiar. And subconscious mind decides what love is based on what's familiar. So that's just something to keep in mind if you're working with a relationship issue, because resolving the reason that the client actually chose their partner that they're having an issue with, if you heal the underlying pattern, that may actually negate the need for them to have that relationship any further. They may actually lose their attraction. So it's kind of like becoming an ex-smoker. You know, you don't want to hang out with the other smokers anymore. It just loses its appeal. So that's it for this time. That's 4 attachment patterns. And think about how you can use this information in your regression sessions with your client, and leave your comments, please. I want to hear what you have to say and how you can use this information. If you've got questions, I'm happy to answer them. Okay, that's it for this time. I'm Wendie signing off. Ta-ta.